film that Jeffrey Van Davis did on Heidegger, but then there was an interview by Hicks of Jeffrey Van Davis. So, and that was done years later. I think that was done in 2019, I think. And so, yeah, I apologize. I was on a different. I was in a different frame.
I saw both of them. It just caught my eye because I'd been thinking about that guy anyway, and I just thought it was odd or interesting because he influenced Jordan Peterson, and he also really influenced this guy that I had some friends request me do a video on, who's also influenced by him, and he's just kind of responsible for a lot of, through Jordan Peterson especially, a lot of misunderstandings about postmodernism, because his take on Steven Hicks's take on postmodernism, that it's like, and philosophy in general, and really it's kind of yeah, what's the guy's name that there's this other guy that is also really really popular. In any case, they're both kind of not only anti-postmodern, but they're very anti-philosophy. And so I wondered when I saw Steven Hicks being on that video, I was like, it's kind of part of their whole narrative that Heidegger is, and postmodernism, and Hegel and Kant. He blames it all, like it's this because he's an objectivist coming out of Ayn Rand. So it's like, oh, they're all proto-Nazis. Like even Kant's like this proto-Nazi because he's I guess in their mind, because he's like introducing some kind of subjectivism into like good classical liberal like objective thought or something.
Okay, yeah. Now I'm not that familiar with Hicks, the interviewer, but as I was listening to some of his questions, I got the feeling that he wasn't the sharpest on. I don't know why Jeffrey did the interview with him, but
well, is Jeffrey like? Is it a balanced take? Does he have a balanced take, or is it kind of like? I expected, since Steven Hicks was there, that it was going to be a kind of like takedown of Heidegger, that he's this.
Well, no, Jeffrey was very much a fan of Heidegger. I mean, he got very interested in Heidegger, studied him for quite a while, learned German, and he's a Heidegger scholar. And it took him a while to come around to realizing that there was some substance to what people were saying about Heidegger, not just the person, but also, in a sense, parts of his philosophy, which are a bit troubling from the point of view of National Socialism. So Davis, I mean, that's one reason I like his video, is that there have been people who have tried to indict Heidegger, and I think they have done a relatively poor job of it because they are not that familiar with Heidegger's work. They haven't really understood him. And Davis, I think, has an understanding, at least better than some of the ones I've seen write about this subject. And so I think I'm not saying he's balanced. He does, I think, want to indict Heidegger. He believes at the end of the day, Heidegger is a problematic guy. And not only in his character, but also in his philosophy. Now, he's not one who says that, don't read Heidegger, don't take him out of libraries, nothing like that. But he just says, be cautious, be aware when you're reading him of some of the links and some of the heritage that he comes out of. And so I think he's balanced, and I think he's makes good points. So
well, it does kind of remind me of Steven Hicks and this other guy that I'm thinking of, James Lindsay, who's also a kind of not too bright, but very, very popular. Not as many people know of Hicks, but he influenced Jordan Peterson and this guy, James Lindsay, who are very popular and know even less about philosophy. But James Lindsay did a pretty popular 4-hour thing where he's basically saying Hegel it's all on Hegel, but he's trying to say that Hegel is responsible for wokeism. It's similar to Jordan Peterson, like all these conservatives that are they're kind of coming, like classical liberal, trying to figure out where the kind of badness and insanity of the left is coming from. And so they do this kind of thing that's has a long history in conservatism, where they're like trying to find like the genesis of evil, pretty much. But what's unique about James Lindsay is, though, unlike Peterson, where he and I think this guy Hicks, who kind of talk about postmodernism, and Hicks kind of blames Kant. This guy Lindsay blames Hegel, but he says Hegel is kind of like basically he's coming out of Gnosticism. And so he's not only, in my mind, tapping into all this kind of Cold War propaganda against, any kind of, Marxist or socialist thought, but he's also tapping into, however many millennia of Christian propaganda against any kind of heretical forms of Christianity, which Gnosticism is kind of a blanket term for a lot of them. So yeah, it just really bothers me it's this, I don't know if you've heard of cultural Marxism, but that's it has a legitimate use as a term, but it's also a kind of a label for what a lot of conservative conspiracy theorists think is this very, like, sometimes it takes anti-Semitic forms, but this very kind of like secretive plot to undo Western culture or capitalism, and especially I think liberals of the classical variety, but also maybe, I don't know, some of these more left-leaning liberals also maybe fall into this desire to see what the genesis of totalitarianism is. And for me, it's problematic because I think there's plenty of things to critique about any philosopher, Heidegger included, but I'm a little skeptical of this tendency to see any kind of strong, values and thought as being kind of this, secret seed of totalitarianism, because liberals on both sides, I think, tend to, prescribe to this kind of belief that, that there's a democratic, scientific, neutral system of and capitalism is kind of like the economic symbol or expression of that. And so they're always looking for why it's not working, and there's always some kind of evil or the left liberals now are doing the same thing, where they're just so paranoid about any kind of sign of fascism. And so both sides are just so paranoid about fascism. And so I've kind of come to the conclusion that it's really the religion of liberalism on the left or right, is this as some people are calling it, the religion is never again, right? It's just this paranoia about any kind of strong values as being like the seeds of some coming fascism.
Yeah, I dig what you're saying, because I think there is a lot of that kind of paranoia going on among people who are not in academics, but also some people who are in academics who are not, let's say, extremely well-versed in continental philosophy. Yeah. And that's unfortunate. I think that, trying to indict, all of these different strands of continental philosophy for having, massive negative influence, especially linking postmodernism to relativism, and relativism to anything goes, and the destruction of all the values and all of that. There are dozens of guys who have written on this angle of criticizing postmodernism and continental, the heritage of continental philosophy from Hegel and Kant down that line. And I just think that's really nonsense. It's one needs to be really, really careful and precise. And when criticizing Heidegger, especially, he lately is getting a lot of bad press because of the publication of what's called the Black Notebooks. But people have been responding to that and taking very strong positions. I read an essay recently of someone who's defending Heidegger, and I thought they did a pretty good job. And then I've reviewed this film by Jeffrey Van Davis, and thought he did a pretty good job. I think there's interesting things to be said on both sides, but the more I learn about Heidegger, and I started out as a fan of Heidegger's. I mean, I've written on him, and I've felt that I had a pretty good understanding of some of the value in his philosophy. And so I don't want to throw the whole thing out, but the more I learn about Heidegger and the specifics of his life and some of his less well-known writings, the more I'm kind of turned off by the guy and his thinking. So is he, a strong link to fascism? I don't think so. But is he in that fabric? I think yes. He's inextricably bound up in it, and in ways that are a bit troubling, even in his philosophy. So I think it's interesting to take a closer look at that, but to be careful, because I know Derrida was strongly influenced by Heidegger, but Derrida was also very cautious. He understood that there was something there to some of this, although Derrida, I don't think, ever probed as deeply into it as some of the more current writers have. And so, and Derrida is gone now, and he can't really add more commentary. Derrida, died before the Black Notebooks were published, and Derrida.
So what's in them? That's so damning.
Black Notebooks. Well, they're sort of like a diary that Heidegger kept from 1936, I believe, or maybe it was 1934 to about 1945, the end of the war. And in it, he expressed a lot of his very personal thoughts. Also, he made notes, on different points and aspects of his philosophy and ideas he wanted to explore further. But he made some comments about Jews, which have alarmed a lot of people, and they claim that it's evidence that he was, a dyed-in-the-wool anti-Semite, which I think a couple of several different commentators have indicated, or have basically proven to my satisfaction, that he was not an anti-Semite in the sense of, blood racism, but he does have some anti-Semitism going in terms of how he sees the Jews as well as Christians and people who favor democracy and socialists. He criticized that whole group and put them in the category of those who are caught up and seduced by the modern engine of technology, and that they have these groups have been warped clear down to the metaphysical core by technology and the influence of looking at everything instrumentally. And I think there's something to be said for that.
Something to be said for what he is saying, or
yes,
yeah,
something I think he's onto something there,
right. Okay.
Heidegger. So I don't.
So what's so damning?
But I'm sorry.
So what's so damning about it? Yeah.
Well, from Heidegger's point of view, it's that really beginning with Descartes and his, what you would call the mathematization of metaphysics, in a sense, the idea that somewhere Descartes apparently says, I forget where, that we can become lords and masters of creation through science, through mathematics and the scientific method, and applying mathematics and a mathematical science to nature. And this, many have argued, is, well, and Heidegger has a piece on this. I think it's his writing on technology, an essay, talks about Descartes in this regard, and what happened, that influence on Western culture taking us in a direction of wanting to manipulate and master nature. And so then from that point, he argues that it only gets more intense until we see in World War II, we have basically a war of machines, where we have tanks and guns and all kinds of, technology culminating in the atomic bomb, that is basically us human beings committing a kind of suicide. We're just blowing each other up with this instrumentalization of everything. Everything becomes an instrument. Even fellow human beings are begun to be viewed as nothing more than instruments, as a means to something else.
Right. So what's wrong with this? I don't understand.
You're pulling my leg now.
No, I'm not. No, I'm saying what's wrong with what he's saying.
With what Heidegger is saying?
Yeah. Well, what is so damning about what he's saying? Like, this is all pretty standard fare. I mean, Nietzsche says similar things. Nietzsche's like often accused of being anti-Semitic, but the left still loves him. Like, why is Heidegger getting? Did he even call it his black notebooks, or was this a bunch of liberals like, oh my God, it's black because it's evil? Like,
no, okay. I'm sorry. I see where you're coming from. Yeah, I mean, I think Heidegger is making good points there, and he scores a lot of points with a lot of different groups of people. But this is hard to reconcile with his becoming a member of the National Socialist Party in 1934 and becoming the rector, accepting the rectorship of Freiburg University and making this speech, in praise of National Socialism and the what did they call it? The reorganization under National Socialism of the universities. And so people say, well, how can he be, on the one hand, coming down on technology in this way and accepting National Socialism, which after the war, he basically argues is nothing but another example of the technologization of not only politics, but human culture. So that's where people, get on his case, because he never backtracked. And he never said, well, it was a big mistake on my part to side with the National Socialists in this regard. He never backtracked on it. Instead, he said things basically along the lines that National Socialism is as the Nazis practiced it and implemented it, was way off target. That the kind of National Socialism that he was abdicating was something very different.
Seems legit to me.
I'm sorry.
That seems legit to me. I don't know. Like, I don't see the problem. Like I don't know. I'm a bit influenced too by my friend Peter Wilberg, who died last year, but he was a big Heidegger fan, wrote some books on Heidegger, and he was Jewish, but he's also German, and he like had some pretty extreme views on World War II. But like he recognized all the problems with the Nazis in a similar sense that Heidegger did, but I think it was on Heidegger's part, it was a calculated move to be like, well, this is like most people do in politics, especially in major political movements and parties. They side with the lesser evils from their point of view at that point. And granted, that seems to be controversial, because we've had half a century or more of cultural propaganda telling us that the Nazis were this unique evil and we are on the side of good. But I would argue that things are a little more complicated than that. And yeah, I mean, my friend Peter used to say Churchill was worse than Hitler, and he had a bunch of reasons for that. And yeah, the more I study about World War II, I don't think it's a clear cut like one was better than the other, but I do think that the way that technology is headed, the kind of eschaton or teleology of it is extremely problematic. And I can see why a lot of people would see fascism or National Socialism or some version of that kind of resistance as being a option that could perhaps, slow things down or move things in a different direction, to actually instill some kind of value framework upon the technological machine, whereas Western liberal democracy kind of advertises itself as being, free of values and equal to all, but really what that means is that the machine just rules without any values. And so even if there's still, the machine is not quite under control, and it's a kind of a runaway system, even more so with fascism. Even Deleuze and Guattari, who are very, very much radical leftists, they thought that there was something potentially liberating about the what they called the war machine, and that the state just kind of appropriates it, and then the war machine can go out of control like it did with National Socialism, but that actually it was the revolutionary engine against the state, and that it kind of various commentators have had said similar things, that fascism is kind of like revolution gone wrong or gone out of control. But yeah, I just feel like there's such paranoia about fascism or anything of the far right, and I've dabbled in it a bit myself with I have no interest in any of the far right's racist stuff, but I do see like some value in the current far right, and some of the things that Heidegger was into. And I actually think I'm proud of him for not, like so many people these days that are just so worried about their reputation that they'll like apologize for things that don't need to be apologized for. I mean, he definitely, I think, was a bit naive politically, and he probably should have hedged his bets a little and not thrown in so hardcore, and then have it and then when you're on the losing side of things, get like painted as on the wrong side of history. But I think you've even written about similar defenses of Paul the Man and the way Derrida defended him, and like, I don't know. I think it's not so clear cut of a damnation that the liberal commentators make it out to be.
Well, yeah, let's go over that a little bit, because this is really interesting stuff to me. And so let me be clear on where I'm coming from. And that, okay, one, I think that Heidegger's critique of technology is very worthwhile, and there's many aspects of it, and possibly most all of it, that I would agree with. Number two, I think later on, after the war, when he was condemning the technologization of culture in National Socialism, I think there's something to be said for that too. As you were just acknowledging, maybe they went a little overboard with the mechanization of everything, which you can see in their bureaucracy too. But I think there are criticisms to lodged against the democracies as they were operating during World War II, both America and Britain and the Soviets. Although they're not necessarily a democracy, they weren't really a socialist or communist country either. It's hard to define the Bolsheviks, but anyway, there's serious criticisms to be made against all of that. They're all guilty of certain war crimes, and but I think we still have to hold on to what happened with respect to the Holocaust and where the responsibility for that lies. I think that's important, and to not let the Nazis off the hook for that. And that, I think, is where I fault Heidegger, in that he could not step forward and apologize for, even if, as he claims, he was not fully aware of what was going on in the death camps, but he could nevertheless have still come forward and apologized publicly and vehemently for having been associated with that. He could have said, "Hey, look, I admit I screwed up badly here," but he never did. He didn't want to do that. and he held to his criticism of all of the different factors or parties in the world, the National Socialists, the Americans, the Soviets, even the Jews. All of these entities were groups that he wanted to level criticism against, and he didn't want to apologize for anything. So I fault him for that. I think that's bad. It's just a sign of bad character. You can't.
He could have been nicer to Husserl after all Husserl did for him, and
Yeah, and there's other things that come out in the video of Jeffrey Van Davis's video where you say, "Oh my God," like he couldn't apologize for that and that and that. But so yeah, it's a mixed bag, and but there are things to be seen in Heidegger, but I would come back at him a little bit in that, I side with the critique of technology. I think there's a great deal of danger to be had there, but I want to defend technology as well, and that everything that humans do is really technology. From language is a technology that humans invented, and it we didn't who knows when language got started, but it's a superb technology, and all of it, fire, everything else that has come into the realm of human capacities for manipulating their environment for survival purposes, and then beyond that for convenience and luxury and God knows what. If you're going to criticize technology, you've got a whole bag of things there that you have to reject, and I don't think that's right. After all, we ourselves, human beings, are a product of nature, and everything we do, therefore, is a product of nature, and technology is part of that. We have to understand and manage our technology, just like we have to understand and manage our differences, and in our political organizations, which, by the way, is something I really like about your essay, Sacrifice and Repetition. You get into that significantly, and I think the points you make are very good about, accepting and finding a place for our differences, and not allowing them to become points of violent conflict. And the ways in which you navigate that and the recommendations that you make, I think, are very good. So these things are nuanced. I think that's what makes it difficult, and people don't want for them to be nuanced. They want for them to be simple, and it's just not simple. So there, I hope I've clarified some of my position on Heidegger, but I think for the most part we're in agreement about that, and I don't reject some of the stuff coming from the far right entirely either. I think there are points of commonality. There are ways to find common ground, and I wish we would all put more effort into that. So I like that aspect of what you're doing.
cool, thank you. Had you seen a lot of the TV shows and movies that I referenced in that essay? Have you seen the Quentin Tarantino's Hollywood film?
I haven't. I started to. Okay. I have to admit, I sat down. I said, okay, I'm going to force myself to watch this, even though I'm not a fan of Tarantino. I said, I've got to watch this just because I'm a critic and I need to be able to know what's going on here. And so I started out watching it, and I got about, I don't know, 20 minutes into it, and I just said, I can't do this. It was the part, I think, where Brad Pitt is like feeding his dog on a can of something. And I said, okay, all right, I've got to step away from this right now. So, but I've seen clips of all parts of it. I felt like I've seen pretty much the whole movie from watching various clips of it. And But no, I haven't sat down and watched the whole thing. But I have seen Inglorious Bastards, and I have seen Django and that sort of stuff. So I feel there are aspects I can talk about. But actually, what I wanted to talk about a little bit, if you're up for it, is Apocalypse Now. You say some really interesting things about that film, and I was going to read a couple of things back to you that you wrote to see if we can talk a little more about that,
Yeah,
because
sure.
um, I liked parts of what you were saying, and yet there were some parts where I had questions. So let me, I have it right here. Let's see. Not that you need to follow along here, but I'm on page 24 of your text. And where you say, the hero Willard, played by Martin Sheen, sacrifices Kurtz, played by Marlon Brando, not with his gun, a symbol of his social order, but with a machete, which is intercut with a scene of a ritual bull sacrifice. And with this sacrifice, he is not siding with the social order against an out-of-control primal order of nature, but integrating the cultural and natural orders in his own individuation process, which sees the excess of both orders and redefines them in himself. Now that struck me as a really interesting way to look at that. I have to admit that I placed upon that a much more conservative kind of interpretation. But in the next paragraph, you conclude with, you say, but rather a, let's see, well, let me just read that whole paragraph. It's very short. Sacrifice need not be framed as a complete repression or annihilation of any side, as it is in melodrama, nor a reactive and reductive attempt at integration, as in Joker, but as a simple curbing of excess, nor as a simple curbing of excess, but rather a process of transvaluation that does not cut off the extremes of opposition into some neutral or neutered compromise, but redirects both orders to the ends of the individuated person. Now, that statement in itself, I think, is great. I support that, and I agree with that trend. If that's what we can do, is redirect this to the ends of the individuated person. I think that would be something I would support. And but my question is that what's going on in this concluding scene, in the concluding scenes of Apocalypse Now? Because I just sort of, the way I was looking at it, I just sort of felt that, kind of like consistent with Heart of Darkness, the novel, as we journey down that river, it's like we're going into a darker and deeper depths of darkness. It's like things get worse, in the movie Apocalypse Now. There's just one scene, the violent scenes just get more intense as you go down the river. And by the time you get to Kurtz and the village he's in there, then things get really dark. And then the concluding scene with the machete slaying and the buffalo and all of that is pretty heavy. And then we have the Doors music, I think, that's playing when that's happening too. Wow. The first time I saw that, it was like, wow. So it made an impression. But my sense of it was that, this has just gotten deeper and darker, and the message is that, this is humanity. This is the heart of darkness, which is at the core of humanity, and leaving us with the question, well, what do we do about it? And I don't think Willard, is coming out looking like an individuated person who has somehow, managed to find an escape from this, but he has become a part of it. He has stepped into the violence and accepted the role of killing Kurtz and, so to speak, you know, done his grocery clerk duty and sullied his hands pretty much like anyone else. And I'm not left with an optimistic feeling about what's going to become of him. So that was my take. But if I'm reading what you're saying here correctly, that's not your take. You have a different sense of where Willard is at the end of it. Am I right about that?
Yeah, I think if he was just doing the grocery clerk duty, as Kurtz accused him of, he would have killed him with the machine gun. He would have just done it in a very unconscious way, just being an instrument of the military. But I think the whole thing is him, learning and understanding Kurtz, but then realizing that Kurtz himself even has gone too far and hasn't really achieved what he had wanted. And in the paper, I'm definitely creatively reading into it, which is what I tend to do with things, and trying to make it a point of revaluation, or transvaluation rather. So I could see why people might read it that way, but I don't think he's just simply doing his duty. I think there's a lot to argue that he's kind of caught between two worlds, and he, in the end, if he had just been like letting go of his military role and becoming like Kurtz and just become lost in the jungle instinct, then I think he would have stayed there. He would have become the king in some sense, like the king would be slaughtered and he would become the next king. That would complete the kind of Oedipal cycle. And I first saw that film when I was in high school, and I was a very fanatical Doors fan. And so when in the end, I think is the work, their song that's just the most transcendent. And there's that whole Oedipal scene where Morrison reenacts the Oedipal drama, and but he's coming at it from a shamanic angle, and so he's not like a simple Freudian. The Doors said that their key text to understanding them was Nietzsche's Birth of Tragedy, and so they really felt like there was this essential synthesis that could happen between Apollo and Dionysus. And I know Nietzsche in his later work kind of thought that was too Hegelian, but I still think there's a similar thing going on in later Nietzsche. And I think in that text, I kind of try to tease that out by saying, okay, there's a similar kind of like third step going on in true creative transvaluation, but it's not a simple like synthesis. It's not like, as I said in that quote, like just a neutering process into some neutral third, but that it is a kind of like a return to like what maybe Deleuze would call the plane of immanence. And so for me, that's my kind of way of talking about Deleuze's. He even calls it indifference and repetition. He even calls his philosophy a dialectic. And so there's this sort of dialectic involved, but it's not just a kind of simple integration of two things. It is a kind of like a destruction of both, and a return or rebirth of their differences in a creative direction. And I try to say, it's coming out of the individuated person's will, but I also kind of try to temper that a bit and be like, well, what is an individuated person? And well, it could be any kind of line of flight, right? And so it's not necessarily a person or an individual as much as this process of the creative kind of coming out of its earlier modes, where I say in one part in the essay, there's kind of like a first stage, which I liken to asexual reproduction, where it's one over the other, and then the kind of more dialectical or second level, where there's kind of sexual reproduction, where the two are kind of annihilating each other, and then a third is coming out, but then it ends up being a kind of repetition. But that there's a third level where I call it kind of a tantric level, kind of trying to point towards tantric philosophy, where the climax of sexual reproduction, where the two are annihilated into the third, that gets kind of relayed and delayed into a kind of a more, continuous transformation where things are literally like a plane of eminence. It's actually where Deleuze and Guattari got their title, "A Thousand Plateaus," was they got out of Gregory Bateson, who was studying shamanic societies, I think in Indonesia, or he was commenting on their tantric-ish sexual practices where they would delay the orgasm. And so this concept of 1,000 plateaus are just kind of like different levels of intensity. And I think,
Sort of different
yeah,
levels of ecstasy, of the kind of ecstatic horizons, or
sure, in the sexual sense, but there's an ontological sense where, for instance, Carlos Castaneda, like in the beginning of his book, Active Side of Infinity, he talks about how like the syntax of our language lends us to thinking of things having beginnings and endings, but like there's other syntaxes where everything is just variations in intensity without beginning or end. And so this is Deleuze uses this word intensity a lot too. And so some commentators were even thought that this was kind of like a good kind of third register, where you got the virtual and the actual, and you have the intensive, where it is the kind of actual dynamic processes that are going on, where the virtual and the actual are interrelating and mutually determining each other through this process of a kind of continually varying intensity. And so for me, that's the kind of third level, is that it's not a culmination. Neither is it an origin, it's the immanent, but it's something that we can kind of approach. And so I kind of tried to wrap that into some of your ideas in media, and looking at movies and TV, and thinking about how so many people are looking for the next thing. Like there's this lot of talk on the internet about meta-modernism. People are wanting to know what's after postmodernism. And it's more of this kind of like, well, do we go backwards and forwards? And in the political arena, it's the same thing. Everyone's like the progress oriented, or then they just want to go back, or the conservatives want to go back to either classical liberalism, or the far right wants to go further back. When really, like, yeah, if we want to find like the continuity of our culture, we have to be able to like find the threads that go through all of them, instead of trying to kind of like, always get to the next thing, or keep things like, statically permanent. Like that in order to actually, for anything to be sustainable, it has to be able to be creatively coherent, as I call my website. So yeah, I'm just trying to like wrap this into some kind of media theory where we can talk about tragedy as being not just like the learning of limits and learning of empathy, but there actually being a kind of meta-modern component. But unlike most people, meta-modernism tends to mean some kind of like return to sincerity, or some kind of intertextual or interdisciplinary way of doing things that has a kind of hybridization of modernity and postmodernity. I'm trying to say, well, it's actually just like creatively reinterpreting everything in ways that we decide, and whatever we decide. Like it doesn't have to be like some amount of modernism or postmodernism. Like for me, and I say in a recent video, like that it's still a kind of, it's really, we haven't figured out postmodernity yet. Like we're still dealing with those problems of postmodernity, this desire to kind of get beyond it. And I don't know if you know this, but yeah, there's like Ken Wilber's coming back in a rebranded form. There's these guys that kind of pretend to be this like Nordic intellectual, and they've written the most famous book on meta-modernism, but it's basically just Ken Wilber repackaged as this kind of like, but it's really popular, I think, because so many people are like, want to get back to meta-modernity.
Do they refer to him directly?
Yeah. Integral theory. I just said, yeah, not get back to meta-modernity, get back to the values of modernity, but with some like, postmodern, some kind of postmodern incredulity or self-reflexivity incorporated in. And I do have some of that in the essay, where I'm saying like, yeah, in late stage drama, there is, I think, this tendency towards self-reflexivity, but it doesn't have to just it just end up being this tragic, like basically a kind of narrative of tragic limitations. And I think Hegel is rightly kind of seen as a philosopher of tragedy for that reason, is that everything's about the labor of the negative. And I think too often tragedy on its own can be kind of just that. It can be just about the tragic limitations, and whereas the messages tend to be more kind of negatively oriented, like, you know, you can't go beyond your limits, or this is, you know, there's complexity, but like we can't really discern what the complexity means. Whereas I think that leads to people being like going back to conservatism, like, oh, we need like more clear standards or values. And so in a recent essay, or a recent video, I ponder Christopher Nolan's latest film and juxtapose it to this movie that conservatives really like lately, Sound of Freedom, as a way
Yeah,
of kind of, yeah, as a way of just kind of,
I looked at a little bit of that. Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying there.
yeah, I just want to argue that there's a way to have positive ideas, of having like, the culture can have its values without them being uncritically or dogmatically accepted, you know. So it just doesn't seem like that far-fetched for me, for people to do, but everyone's like just like just going crazy trying to figure out what to do with postmodernism. For me, it's not that radical. It's not that like relativistic, or, you know, just understanding that we should be able to like adjust our values to context. For me, is and from a common sense point of view, is pretty easily done. Like, but everybody's so transfixed by their belief systems and abstractions that they just can't figure out, like, it's not relativism. It's just literally just like deciding values in context, and for it. And I say in a Jordan Peterson video that I did, like, this is actually how values really work. If you're really sticking to principles and values, you have to be able to see how they change in context. Like, it's just, I don't know. I think it's just should be common sense if people weren't so attached to the forms of their ideas and the strict letter of literal interpretation of text.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, I have to agree with all that. Yeah, that's there's just so much rigidity that seems to be crystallizing around some of these polarized positions that it's discouraging. And I I like what I saw you doing, and just now as you were explaining and touching on the notion of sacrifice. Um, I like what you're doing with that in terms of like, I of course came at it from, oh, and I was, hammering away at melodrama and thinking of sacrifice as, a kind of violence that is so polarized and scapegoating like, and I was influenced in some of my thinking on that by this guy Kenneth Burke, who was an American literary critic and rhetorical theorist. And sacrifice and redemption played a big role in his thinking on rhetoric, because he had kind of a secularized Christianity incorporated into that. And but what sacrifice does not necessarily have to indicate, even in the form of violence, does not have to indicate a kind of polarized conflict. And you bring that out, I think, in what you're saying about having a different look at drama and tragedy. And I think that's good. I think it's right. And as far as it goes to, because like I think part of the point you're making is that sacrifice is going to be inherent in everything that we do as a society. If we're going to have any society at all, any community, we're each as individuals, we're going to have to give up certain things in order to live with other people, in at least in nonviolent ways. And I think we haven't yet theorized that as thoroughly as perhaps we need to, and I see you doing some of that in this work, and that goes beyond much of what I have done. I've been handling some of the critique of the highly polarized forms of violence, but I haven't gotten as far into looking at the ways in which we have to look at it if we want to form community. And that's been kind of an ongoing and future project of mine is to look at more deeply into how do we form good community. And I think that appears to be a primary interest of yours as well.
Yeah, and I really think that the liberal platitudes are getting in the way because it's making people think that there's some kind of freedom that exists where nobody has to give up anything as long as they don't like explicitly harm other people, that there's this neutral system that we're, you know, through science or through the political process or technology, we're all headed there. And if we can just kind of like, you know, get rid of the people with any kind of specific cultural project, and so anything that reminds them of that is fascist, and that gets treated very aggressively. But I think it's gonna lead to the end of our our planet. I mean, it's the Matrix. It's like, yeah, we're gonna plug in and everybody's gonna be able to do anything they want, and that's all well and good. But yeah, there's no sacrifice to anything higher. It's all about like freedom, right? And as I say in that essay, like I think this was kind of a compromise that the cultural war of the 60s turned into the libertarianism of the 70s, because I think it kind of took advantage of the communal vision that both the conservatives and the hippies had, that they were like, well, this culture war isn't working out, so let's just all decide to, we can have our drugs and you can have your values or whatever, but like we're just gonna like leave each other alone and just pursue our own individual interests. And that gave birth to this identity politics, when everybody's just fighting over values, but nobody, and the system's loving it because nobody's challenging it with any actual alternative way of life. It's all just about like opinions, you know. It's just a cultural war, and there's no longer any, you know, even the left, who's all about material conditions and you know, material revolution, it's just a myth. They tell themselves at this point, like they have no interest in actually connecting with the working class. In fact, most of the working class is conservatives and they hate them. It's a joke, I think. And so the far right's looking at this and being like, this is a joke. Like, we have to have values. Every democracy is kind of, you know, coming out of Plato, even, like, you know, it's kind of an illusion. So let's at least just be more explicit about the kind of values that we have. I just don't think they have the right answer, because all they can think of is, well, like, let's go back to the Western traditions values, which are what, like mainstream Christianity? No, I don't think so. I think that there needs to be a kind of multicultural value system that can, and I think the occult tradition and the New Age even are very vital for this. And everybody hates the New Age and everybody hates postmodernism because they're both kind of caricatured in such extreme ways. But really they're aspects of everything that we're doing. They're kind of like the repressed shadow. And so everybody's pretending to be liberal or conservative, but we're all basically postmodern New Agers in some ways, but nobody wants to admit it, because to actually like address the underlying metaphysics that's involved in both of those, you know, I think the New Age is just kind of, in a way, the kind of popular, like dumbed down version of what came out of postmodern philosophy, which is just a reflection of our postmodern culture in general, which is basically, to somebody that can't think in any other way but like generic abstractions, it looks like relativism and nobody can handle it. And so they're just freaking out and going to these solutions that aren't working and aren't even like meshing with reality. Like the fact that these far right people think like conservative Christianity is somehow going to, like, you know, be the next thing. Like it's ridiculous. Like everybody is so like diverse, and like I have such different values from the person next door to me, let alone like the whole country. Like how are we going to have a nationalist project based around a unified cultural system like Christian, like medieval Christianity? I mean, come on, it's ridiculous.
Yeah, it's frightening, some of the stuff going on. And I would say that I don't know if I don't recall you using the word anarchy anywhere, but I ran into a couple of people who were writing about anarchy and taking the root of the word as anarchy, meaning a kind of leaderlessness, and thinking that there was something to be said for that, that we can go around and be leaderless. But that I think meshes with more of this individuation to the point where society itself just dissolves, and we have nothing to hang. We don't have any collective project that we can throw ourselves into and be proud of. And human beings are, to put it crudely, herd animals. I mean, we need community. We need each other. We need, in order for any cultural project to have significance, we have to have community, because we get significance assigned to something by others. Others approve of what we say, which doesn't necessarily mean that we have to, dote on every approval, like happens on some social media, where all we do is like look for likes every day. But we need to be able to appreciate awards and gifts and celebrity that comes from doing things that are judged to be important at a collective level. And if we don't have that, then I think each of our individual lives begins to lose traction in terms of its significance. If it's just up to me, Greg Desilet, to assign significance to my life, I can do that, but I feel kind of lonely doing it. It's like, at the end of the day, I don't know that it's going to be something that I will value that much if I'm the only one who's really impressed by what I do. It has to be something that we're all hooked into together, at least a significant number of people, to form community. And this is what I see as a difference between Christian and Greek values, to go back in antiquity a ways. I think the Greeks and their polis, I mean, they, in the form of the athlete and the philosopher, the intellectual, and their politicians they were all very well-educated people who were hooked into the same project, and they were excited about it. And they all contributed to it in a way that still impresses us today. Like one philosopher that I had as an undergraduate said that we compare what the Greeks did in 20 decades to what Europe did over 200 years. No, wait, over 2 decades. And in other words, the Greeks did in a very short period of time what Europe did over centuries. And in terms of, producing great literature and great politicians and great cultural art and events. And so what we're all floundering for, I think, right now is something like that we can get behind, and we need a new direction. And it's not going to come from religion, because religion has been too discredited. It's a new faith is not going to make it. We need a new, I think, metaphysics. And
well, I mean, religion's always just been the metaphysics for the masses. So I feel like I'm not against religion for that reason, because I think that it's just it tends to be necessary for the average public. It's back then and now still, like, people, even in secular culture, just have civil religions. Basically, the left and the right both are very religious in their political orientations. So yeah, I'm not against religion in that sense, but I do think that it needs to evolve, and that's actually kind of what the founders of religion, if you buy into the claims of esoteric thinkers, is that throughout history there were people that were kind of guiding humanity, and that there were like more, philosopher king like structures of society, and then they've kind of lost hold of it, and things kind of got out of hand. And so in my work, I tend to kind of try to reorient us back towards this like social engineering, but in a more conscious and transparent way, because I think it's still going on. I just think it's going on from how to put it, well, the ancient Vedas and the tradition coming out of that talks about different kind of classes and how they rule at different times. And so we're in supposedly the Kali Yuga, where we're ruled by the merchant class, right? And so that's a dark age, because there's still social engineering going on, but it's being done by a class of people that don't have the best interest. I mean, they think they do. I think they're planners, and they're like, I don't think it's some isolated like monolithic cabal or anything, but I do think that there are some levels in the deep state that have a significant control over things and are kind of constantly modeling and use pretty advanced technology to control the rest of us. And I think that we just need to step out of this dream that we have, that we're somehow like in a democracy, or that we're like headed towards democracy, or that science is headed towards some kind of, this. I think it's kind of basically it's Karl Popper's fantasy that of the open society, and I think even some of the smart people know that democracy is kind of a sham, but for them, again, it's the best of bad options, because it at least kind of keeps fascism at bay, I guess, is the idea. And so many people, especially after World War II, have kind of just all decided upon this, because it's like, okay, we can all kind of like carry on our social antagonisms within this technocratic system in a way that won't lead to all out like world annihilation. So we can all just kind of battle it out on this level of secret espionage and technological manipulation. And so and then the masses can believe that it's a neutral system, and that no like one like cultural system will get the upper hand, so everyone will feel free. And so I think this is what they've settled on, but I think it's definitely not value neutral. We're headed towards a very technologically enslaved matrix like world. And I put that on the fact that people aren't aware that we're always going to be ruled by some value or another. So we need to be able to decide on what that is together and talk about it, and not feel like anybody that wants to say, well, let's go this direction rather than that, is somehow a fascist, because they want to impose their values on everybody else. Like, but I think it would help if people were a little more postmodern and been like, well, this is what I think we should head, but I'm not I'm not saying I want to repress you and want to like kill you if you're I don't know. I don't think Putin is the bad guy you put him out to be. Like, for instance, like him just saying you can be gay, but we don't want to like actually promote this at the level of culture, because, well, especially with Russia, like they have a hard time getting enough people to procreate. And I think that's happening more and more. Fertility rates are dropping like crazy in places like Japan, and now us too. Like, so this kind of technocratic mediation of relationships and sexuality and everything becomes love and relations and community all become about like our identities and our desires, rather than like what really makes us happy, which is like cooperating on a cultural project together. But we can't do that in the system, because it's considered to be quasi-fascist if you have a like an explicit cultural project.
Yes, all good points. But that makes me think of one thing I was going to ask you, and before I even ask this, I know it's a huge question, so I don't expect us to really resolve any aspect of it, but I just kind of wanted to feel out some of your thoughts on it, between socialism and democracy. Now, there's a lot of people, like, for example, Martin Hagelin, who is a philosopher that I admire, who's written on Derrida, but he has a new book out called This Life. In the second part of that book, he talks about how to construct a democratic socialism. And he believes that that's something that we need to do because if we don't, then we're going to be trapped in this cycle of capitalism where we're basically in a metaphysics of consumerism and instrumentalization and making ourselves into agencies rather than agents. And so I think there's a lot of good points in that, but there's other people coming at it from the direction saying no, socialism is not going to work. It just it cannot work because it has features to it that are against human nature. Our basic biological nature is such that we are not going to be divesting ourselves of competition. Humans like competition too much, and capitalism is economic competition. So in order to get socialism off the ground, we need to find some way to cripple our so-called natural instinct for competition, which sounds a lot like the Christian repression of sexuality, or it's an analog to that. It's like taking an aspect of your very nature, your biological nature, and repressing it for the and Freud, civilization and its discontents. It's like we have to take part of our biological nature and suppress it in order to achieve community. Now, that is a form of sacrifice, but I'm not convinced that we need to radically sacrifice those kinds of aspects, either competition or sexuality in our natures, in order to achieve good community. So anyway, I'm wondering, just, shooting from the hip, what your reactions would be between the choice of socialism and democracy as perhaps I've outlined it there, or if you don't like how I've outlined it,
No, I mean, it's definitely a common way of framing it. I don't tend to think like that because I feel like it's an antagonism and a debate that's
too
exhausting. The what?
too dialectical, too polarized.
Yeah, which, and things that are polarized are usually that way because they're generic, right? They tend to be abstract and decontextualized. And yeah, I don't see any antagonism between cooperation and competition. I think we express ourselves and assert ourselves best when there's an environment that's cooperative, right? I feel like so much energy gets wasted in capitalism because we're constantly like competing for really low hanging fruit that doesn't really make us happy and doesn't make us feel like self-actualized. In fact, I think a lot of the AI stuff will be helpful, at least, to like divest people of this belief that their shitty like job is doing anything meaningful to them or to society. Like now that robots can do it better, like what what are you really doing? Why is your life meaningful? No, I'm a big fan of Star Trek, and probably one of my favorite things I've written was just a way too deep reading of some Star Trek episodes and Star Trek in general, and the way that like I think it appealed to people across the political spectrum because it wasn't caught up in all these like dumb 20th century abstractions. Like there's plenty of competition going on and with characters, but they're doing it in a more mature way because I feel like there's an environment that like helps them excel and everybody cooperates. But then in at least in Next Generation and other shows, it's a little different. But in any case, like, yeah, there's ways to learn how to coordinate people's competitive self-actualization drives, and that's what we need to do. And it's already being done, but it's being done in a way that benefits certain people. As I said, I think some like deep state people have a vision for where things are going, and they're taking advantage of that. But I think we're just in a lot of ways just rats in a maze. We're just we think we're actualizing ourselves and we're being like individuals and we love capitalism, but I don't by any means equate capitalism with freedom. I'm a fan of this philosopher Bertrand de Juvenal, who's a little bit on the far right spectrum, but he's also very kind of libertarian in some ways. He wrote a lot of his work in the early 20th century, and but yeah, he says that that the history of democracy has been a history of like further like entrenchment of the mechanisms of power. So his book on power, it's a fascinating kind of historical analysis through that lens of just showing how like so-called progress has just been the progress of monolithic power.
Hmm.
And yeah, so I think the dialectic of socialism and capitalism. I was really happy when Trump came around because finally conservatives stopped like talking about these stupid classical liberal ideas, and we're starting. I feel like I think that was one of the good things about Trump was that he helped conservatives start to realize, well, no, we kind of do want a cultural project. We actually do want healthcare, and we want like a good society. We don't want like capitalism's ruining things. Like maybe we can have a little protectionism, have a little state planning. Um, and I feel like that was, people freak people out because it's kind of like National Socialism, but I'm not as freaked out by that word. Like, I think that, socialism with values is actually what we need to do. It doesn't necessarily have to be nationalistic. Although I do think nationalism has its place because globalism is kind of the technocratic planner's vision. And so nationalism is kind of a foil for the WEF and other global organizations that I think are busy trying to erode power at all the local and regional levels. So I think nationalism has its place, but I don't think like cultural nationalism is the answer. But I do think like having kind of regional blocks of power and like cooperating on certain levels, but then having like, having central planning based on the values of the community and being able to like coordinate and get people to, maybe participate. But I'm not naive about the fact that not everybody wants to be deciding every issue. People do want leaders in some ways. So I don't really think leaderless societies is again, I think that illusion is part of what is part of what basically fools us into just thinking, oh well, as long as there's no explicit value at work or some strong visible leader, that we're all like the people are in charge. And this is de Juvenal's point, is that it was the most genius like work of power to like convince everybody that it's the people that are in charge. But it's just, for me, it's just a sophisticated level of power. And what I like about Deleuze's idea of the control society is just this. Again, it's kind of like Hegel's third level, but instead of taking it to be some kind of like better level, we're just returning to a more fluid, immanent level of power where the traditional hierarchies are kind of eroded. But then that actually delivers us to the real game, which is, I think, been obfuscated by these kind of like intermediate stages where things seem to be like patriarchal and hierarchical in some explicit way. But really power works, as him and Foucault were really good at pointing out, power works as a distributed system. It's always a network. So now we're getting more of a network control society, and it's not making us more free at all. It's making power even more ubiquitous. But that also can potentially make it more, it could potentially respond, because we do all have power now in a way that maybe not, it would never be possible in pre-modern society. But the fact remains is that we have power because we've all been seduced into this monolithic network. And so my Star Trek essay, I point this out, and I say this is why the Borg are such a great metaphor for not only the problems of the Federation and Star Trek, or like a dark mirror to them, but a dark mirror to democracy and like federal government and in general, because it's always this kind of seduction of, oh, come in and you're one of us, but then you lose yourself in the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a troubling aspect of what can happen, and that would be, National Socialism, just as a term, kind of makes some sense in terms of this notion of trying to build some community and have some common project. But then when you put in front of it what it can bleed into, which would be totalitarian National Socialism, then you get too much control from the top, and pretty soon you've got some what's the word, dystopian society. But and that I think is what has happened in some of the real world socialist, so-called Marxist states like Russia and China have turned into totalitarian nightmares, and we see that playing out in spades today with what's going on both in China and in Russia. But I think you're right. I agree with what you're saying about, we can have um, uh, cooperation and competition. In fact, I believe, competition is a form of cooperation, and
Yeah,
cooperation is a form of competition.
yeah,
I
of
mean, the two go together.
course.
Um, and I think that makes perfect sense. But I think we have to latch onto a political system that incorporates that shows how to get that to play out in constructive ways, like you're talking about, which are possible. And Star Trek was kind of an interesting example, because whenever I watched, the original series and the some of the more recent versions of it, I see that a lot of interesting interactions, but there's a lot of cooperation, and they get together to solve problems.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what you're talking about in some of your essays about how this we don't necessarily need some rigid framework. We just need a structure within which we can aid each other in working through problems as a community. And that supposedly is what our Congress and our United States system is supposed to be doing, but it's dysfunctional now. It's not working.
I would argue it's working very well for the people that it's supposed to be working for. And I would argue that we're no less totalitarian. In fact, I think we're much more effective. And that's kind of my point, is that I think this kind of explicit totalitarian structure is kind of an immature form of power. And so control societies, which is what Deleuze calls what we're moving into, is just a more mature form. And so I think these theorists I'm talking about, Dujuvenel especially, just shows how, like, yeah, the democracy and the erosion of explicit authority is not like a negation of totalitarianism. It's actually its culmination. And so I think when a power structure has to use explicit fear, there's a kind of, maybe a somewhat of a duality between the Orwellian and the kind of Aldous Huxley Brave New World. And I kind of think of the Brave New World as being a kind of and in some of my essays, I even call it like a patriarchy and a matriarchy. And so I say there's good reason, for instance, that the Borg have a Borg queen, because this is this kind of, mother nanny state, or something that as conservatives call it. But it's about like any kind of social connection being kind of eroded and turned into this network where we're told it's all neutral and equal, but actually now we're much more dependent upon it.
Mhm.
And so in medieval times, yeah, like, Foucault said, yeah, this is sovereign power, but like you can get punished out of the blue, but you weren't getting like controlled at the level that you were in the disciplinary societies of modernity. And those aren't anywhere near as controlled as what Deleuze calls control society, where everything is regulated at like, even now we're moving into at the biological level. Like we're moving into a level of totalitarian control that was, inconceivable to Orwell. I think maybe Huxley had a better idea of it, but it's more about seducing us into being accomplices, right? And so there's this quote that I start the Star Trek essay with this quote from this little known Latin American aphorist who said, modern power, for modern power, obedience is no longer enough. It demands now accomplices. So you don't just have to obey; you have to take part. So that, and you want to take part.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
I also have another essay where I talk about. Have you seen that show, Ozark? Were you interested in that at all?
Oh yeah, yeah. I've seen all of that. That's a great show.
So I have another short essay on that I'd love to get your feedback on. But yeah, I say a similar thing, that like, unlike Sopranos and Breaking Bad, where it's about these like patriarchs in post-modernity, like losing their sense of masculinity and their patriarchal authority, I feel like Ozark's much more interesting to me, because it is about like a similar setup, but about like this control society where like power is all about not the explicit power of the man, but that power of networking and that women are really good at. So it's not about, I call it a matriarchy, but I try to be clear. I mean, I'm not saying women are in charge or have more power necessarily, but it's a kind of power that women tend to be really good at, which is, and I think in very sophisticated technocratic states are also very good at, which is not about, the threat of violence. It's about, much more sophisticated forms of power. When power has to use explicit violence, it tends to have, it already is kind of, as I say in that one essay that you read on physics and power, I think it's kind of already fallen down into a realm of struggle, and so it's already kind of compromised itself. Like true power doesn't need to struggle, it doesn't need to threat. It's already controlling the whole board.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and that's exactly right. I think it's power does not need threat, nor should it need violence. It can work in more insidious ways. But yeah, that show is an interesting show. I could talk a long time about that. Oh, it's like, wow. But yeah, I agree with a lot of what you're saying here, and I think that there's you know, I have to admit I'm kind of floundering toward what a solution is to it all. It's kind of overwhelming.
Well, this is the thing, Greg, is that it doesn't, we're so enamored with systems, right? Not only us philosophers and intellectuals, but like everybody. We all want the right idea and think that that's going to solve things. But the system doesn't matter that much. Like, the power will make use of whatever systems are there, right? So it needs to happen on a much deeper level where people are able to be aware of what's actually going on and not be so mesmerized by the surface level of things, because the sophistication of power now is so advanced that nobody's gonna like start a revolution and take over and implement some drastically new system. We have to work with what we have, and the mechanisms kind of end up reflecting the kind of power that's basically living in the heart of all of us in all our relationships. And so this is why I'm more of an occultist than some kind of political thinker. I like looking at politics as a reflection of the underlying psychic or spiritual politics that's going on, which is about ideas, but it's about the ideas that really rule our hearts and our behavior and our consciousness, not the ones that we like spout and argue about, because those tend to be just kind of symbols and that we mask our true impulses and intentions with, and those are what really matter.
Mm, mm. Yeah, I think you're onto it because yeah, I don't think there's going to be some grand solution. I mean, I'm a person who comes out of a generation where and of an attitude of if there's something broken, I want to fix it. And I think there's got to be a way to fix it, and there's got to be something that will harmonize it all, and that's caused me a lot of grief at different points in my life. I
Women
think
don't want that, Greg. They just want you to listen.
exactly right, exactly right. And as Nietzsche says, truth is a woman. So I'll listen, but I need to let go of some of that. And so I think you're on the right track. We need to work with what we have, and we need to and that's what I think a key to making diversity work is too. It's be open to be flexible and be open, and never think that you've gotten it all right. I had, here's an analogy for you that you'll probably get a laugh out of, because, like whenever I tell people I'm a golfer, they say, oh my God, you're one of those country club people. Oh, Jesus, I don't want to even listen to you anymore. But I like golf, but I approach it very spiritually. To me, it's a spiritual meditation because it causes you to focus so hard. But anyway, I was taking a lesson from this guy the other day, and he and I was going through, and finally, I felt like I made a breakthrough. And I said, I think I've got it. And he says, wait, I appreciate that, but don't ever say I think I've got it. Because that's the point where you're stepping into trouble. Golf is like life. You never get it. You're just always challenged, and it's an ongoing thing. And there is no quick fix or solution. You don't walk away saying, "Oh, okay, it's all solved now." So anyway, I've probably got to go here in a little bit, but I did want to mention one thing to you. In reading your essay, the last paragraph of Sacrifice and Repetition, I wanted to read back to you because, and I hope I want to embarrass you by being too complimentary, but I just think this is an outstanding paragraph. And there's one particular part of it that I think is especially good, but the whole thing is good. So let me just read it for the benefit of anybody who does listen to this. This is the conclusion of your Sacrifice and Repetition essay. But when we are in harmony with our times, not fighting youth or old age, not clinging to what we think is the true tradition or the necessary evolution of society, but listening to the messages hiding in our violence, I'm going to come back to that, and looking for what possibilities may be sacrificed to preserve and develop that which matters in every value or tradition, we can find the threads of continuity that place every violent call for identity and transcendence within a tapestry of supportive relations and opportunities for expression. This way of thinking and expression, this fractal and immanent mode of creation, can place us each in extraordinary times with important contributions to make to a global culture so long in the making. That's beautiful. And the thing that one of the parts that stands out to me is that listening to the messages hiding in our violence. I mean, that is an outstanding phrase. I have to remember that, because listening to the messages hiding in our violence. And I think if we can do that, we're going to be so much better off, because as Derrida has shown on many occasions, violence is in the very fabric of everything we do. We can't avoid it. We can't avoid sacrifice. We can't avoid, what we might call the benign forms of violence that just happen, whether we want them to happen or not. And so, but looking closely at how that works, where violence crops up, where we can possibly manage it, where we can lessen it, where it's outrageous, or where it's judged to be immoral or totally destructive. We need to be aware of what's hiding in our violence, and I think you're really on to that, and I just have to compliment you on that. So thank you.